All right. So I think we'll try to get started here. Thanks everyone for showing up. Appreciate the opportunity to do waveforms part two, which is the abnormal stuff. So I think it'll be interesting, abnormal in the sense like if there's something wrong, not something wrong, if there's something abnormal in like within the equation of motion. So if the resistance has changed or the compliance has changed, or if the patient takes a breath, like how does the waveform change, which I think is important because it can sort of like speak to a few things of what's going on. And, if you can look at the waveform and deduce like what's happening, then you know what you need to do to maybe sort of like ameliorate the situation. So as usual, this is who I am. I think all you guys probably know who I am at this point, but started in Philly, did residency there, then moved to DC for fellowship, sort of stuck around a part of a ventilator course that's through the NIH that we teach to residents and fellows. I mean, not residents, some residents, not really though, more like fellows and attendings throughout the country. So it's like my I forget, I think like third year teaching it. And so this is sort of like how we teach the vent. So all right, so if you remember from the first webinar, pressure control, we got to the equation of motion through Ohm's law, which essentially is V equals IR. So you set up a gradient of something, and then you have a flow of said something over that gradient, which is sort of impeded by the resistance. And then if you set up a bigger gradient, then you get more flow. If you run out of the gradient or the gradient is no longer there, then you stop getting flow of said thing. So we started with V equals IR, and then we sort of like deduce down from V equals IR to, so P airway, so PAW is P airway, so sort of like your peak airway pressure. And then where it's sort of going to is the alveolar pressure, so P alv equals your flow times your resistance. P alv in of itself is sort of made up of the volume over the compliance plus the total PEEP. So that pressure equals your alveolar pressure or your plateau pressure. So rearranging, we get the equation of motion, which is P airway equals flow times resistance plus volume over compliance plus PEEP total. I think that's important to know, and it seems like maybe sort of scary and like maybe um, not workable or something you can't use at the bedside, but I think it is, and I hope to sort of prove that point. So, as I said before, V over C plus PEEP total. So PEEP total includes auto PEEP. So if your set PEEP is 5, but you have 5 of auto PEEP, that's a total of 10. So the total of 10 is where you're going to start from in expiration. So if you have 10 of inspiratory pressure, so you're going from essentially 10 to 20. So a delta of 10 or delta pressure. This is where all these terms sort of like get confusing. But if you're getting a certain volume with a PEEP of 5 and a delta pressure of 15 going to 20, and then there's auto PEEP. So now instead of going from 5 to 20, you go from 10 to 20. With less of a delta, you're going to get less of a gradient and ultimately less of a volume. So this is sort of like what we think about when when the compliance goes down, you need a higher delta pressure to drive in the same amount of volume. So if you use pressure control with like ARDS, let's say, you need to be cognizant of the volumes because remember, the vent's not going to alarm for peak airway pressure because we set the peak airway pressure. So I mean, unless you like set it high and then it alarms, but why would you do that? It's not going to alarm ever in pressure control for peak airway pressure because we set it. So that's an important thing to consider. Okay, so building it, and this sort of is from the first webinar on pressure control. So this is at PEEP. So this is like you can say PEEP 5 or something, where whatever your heart desires. So then on inspiration, so you cycle into inspiration. So you have a trigger, either flow, pressure, time, something triggers the ventilator initially. So you get this burst of pressure. So you go from, this isn't like exact because there's a little bit of a delay because of the ramp, etc. But let's just, for simplicity's sake, you go from 5 to a total of 20. So you have a delta of 15. So we added 15 of pressure. In that sort of initial second, or sort of like split second, you have this massive difference in pressures. So you have this massive sort of upstroke and flow. So initially you have it's like massive upstroke and flow, but you don't have any volume just yet because you just generated flow. Now, as you have flow over time, you'll generate a volume. So this is sort of like my way to depict how the pressure difference is. So your airway pressure is much higher than your PEEP. Therefore, the bigger triangle is sort of sloping towards a smaller triangle. And this should probably be P-alv, not PEEP. But that's like what I was set up to two different pressures. If you can imagine in the airway, you have this big pressure. At the alveolus, you're at PEEP. So now you have this big delta. So you're going to have flow over time, i.e. a total volume. So as you move through the breath cycle, so let's just say, this is like 1 second. It's just easy to make the math and to sort of think about it in your mind. And remember, in pressure control, much like in PRVC, we set the inspiratory time. So that's, one of the things that makes it pressure control is that we set the I time. So maybe you're like halfway through the breath. So you have this sort of initial rise and flow. Then you start to decay towards the baseline as you fill the lung up, as you sort of normally breathe, right? If you take a breath in now, sort of like the most flow you're going to get is right in the beginning because you have the highest delta pressure. As you get flow and volume, start to exert a pressure, and that pressure differential shrinks, and then the flow goes down and down. Now, you can drop your diaphragm more and get more flow, but that's not because of sort of the strict mechanical properties of the lung, right? You're including your diaphragm in that. And that's kind of like the basis for PSILI, not patient self-induced lung injury. All right, so let's assume that at the end of inspiration, your airway pressure equals your alveolar pressure. And this will be important because as we talk about this stuff and like changing each of the variables, if you assume that at end of 1 second, the airway pressure equals the alveolar pressure, then you're not going to have any flow, right? So the pressures will equalize. You'll have no flow at the end. So we're going to make that assumption. That's not always true. And depending on the mechanics of the lung, if you set up and what you make the I time, if you make it like 0.7 seconds, then it's not going to be the same. But after we talk about this, theoretically, you should be able to like walk through what the flow curve will look like. So if there's still flow, you should think about if there's still flow at the end of the breath, what is the alveolar pressure? Is it higher or lower than the airway pressure? So think about that in your mind's eye. Okay. So another way of saying this is, so in the beginning, so these red dots, if I dropped a straight line, right, you're at your inspiratory pressure, sort of your peak inspiratory pressure right in the beginning. Your flow is exploded. Right in that beginning millisecond, you have no volume delivered just yet. So your volume is still 0, right? So at this moment, at the red dot, we're going to rewrite the equation of motion. There's no more V over C component because there's no volume. So 0 divided by C equals 0. Now, what I wanted to highlight here is the units that we don't talk about enough. But so airway pressure is in centimeters of water, flow is in liters per second, resistance is liters per second per centimeters of water. And then your PEEP is centimeters of water. So if you multiply that out, you would get rid of the liters per second of the flow. You'd get rid of the liters per second of the resistance, and then you'd just be left with pressure. So essentially what I'm saying is that in the initial part of the breath, the flow that's generated is directly proportional to the delta pressure you set if the patient is passive. And which I should say that all these, all of our, unless I otherwise stipulate, all the patients are passive because we have to sort of understand that first before we can move into like when the patient starts to interact with the ventilator, what's going to happen. Which I think honestly we do it backwards and we try to sort of like figure out what the patient's like doing with the vent, but we don't really understand what it should look like if there was no interaction. So what I wanted to highlight was, the flow is directly proportional to the delta pressure you set if the patient was passive, i.e. if the PEEP was 5 and the delta pressure was 15, if the PEEP was still 5 and it made the delta pressure 10, there would be less flow because there's less of a gradient. Similarly, if the delta pressure was 15 and I made it 25, then your flow should go up because there's a higher gradient. So as you move through these red dots, if I drop the line here, I put flow and resistance in lowercase letters because as you move through the breath, and this line, which I should have made a different color, but I didn't, just by accident, I overlooked it. But let's say, this line that I drew here, this is your alveolar pressure. So the pressure in the alveolus, i.e. your plateau pressure. So as you move through inspiration, your alveolar pressure is rising. As your alveolar pressure rises, your flow is going to go down because your delta pressure goes down if the patient's passive. So as you fill the lung up with volume, that exerts a pressure. Your delta pressure gets smaller and smaller. And then at some point, we're going to assume, just for these cases, just to sort of like wrap our minds around it, that at the end of inspiration, your airway pressure equals your alveolar pressure. So if your airway pressure equals your alveolar pressure, there should be no more flow. That's a key, that's like a tremendously key concept. And most of the things that are wrong with mechanical ventilation hinge on the fact that we can't seem to like, not that we can't understand that, but that's a fact that like we don't like take into account that if there is still flow at the end of the breath, there's still a delta pressure. Now, that could either be because the patient's breathing, so they're sort of like interacting with the ventilator, or it could be because for whatever your settings are. So the I time is like too short or something like that, right? So that's a key point, because what we hear often is the driving pressure, like, is this delta pressure? Because theoretically, it's your PEEP, and then your plateau becomes whatever the delta is. But that gets sort of morphed into that's your driving pressure. But if the patient's not passive, then that's not sort of the driving pressure that we think of when we think of like driving pressure less than 15, because the patient's active. So you don't know what the driving pressure is because you don't know what the alveolar pressure is because there's still flow. So the alveolar pressure could be anything, right? Like 1 to infinity. So without directly measuring it, or if the flow curve gets to 0, then you know that there's no more delta pressure. So your airway pressure equals your alveolar pressure. It's like a key concept that we overlook at times, I think. So that's important. Okay. So now this will probably have to be a whole nother talk, I guess, is this idea of like PMUS, so patient effort. So patient effort, when you take a breath in, you drop your diaphragm, you create negative intrathoracic pressure, which is still true when you have someone on the ventilator. Imagine you have sort of like the vent pushing from the top, but then the patient sort of like pulling down from the bottom. So what you get is more flow than what you would normally get with this delta. So this delta would give you some flow. So like, some flow number, and then like some volume, that's the area under this curve, which I'm drawing with the mouse, which is never good. So it looks terrible. But now that the patient's, taking a breath in, now it doesn't have to be sort of like malignantly taking a breath in, right? They could just be breathing. And, I sort of drew it in like a malignant way. The flow curve is really kicked out. You would sort of think that they were under supported or flow starved, whatever you want to call it. But it doesn't have to be sort of like, so we call this natural decay. So it just sort of decays to 0, right? That's how we normally breathe passively. This is not natural decay. So at the end of inspiration, there's still flow, even though I don't have it like drawn sort of perfectly, but it's a little bit harder on the computer. So you don't know what the alveolar pressure is. And remember, if I drew in purple, this should sort of be natural decay, then all this volume is all extra. And it's all extra that goes sort of above the normal mechanics of the lung, because the patient's taking a breath in to get that extra flow and volume. So the plateau pressure is going to be some number that's higher than it was here. So imagine you just had these two breaths, right? So your plateau pressure would end here because the flow goes to 0. So your plateau equals your airway pressure. And here, you might be able to start to think about, what is that? If I drew, my alveolar curve, right? Like, is it going to end here? No, because there's still flow. Is it going to end here? No, because they got more volume, i.e. more pressure than this other breath on the left. So it's going to end like somewhere up here, not like we can't see, but sort of like theoretical. So meaning, when people say pressure control is great because you can set the airway pressure and the patient won't, the alveolar pressure will just be whatever you set. That's only true if the patient's passive. And I can't like say that enough, because there's always questions about that. In pressure control, your alveolar pressure only equals your airway pressure that you set if the patient's passive and your flow gets to 0. And it could be lower if your I time is lower or your compliance is good or whatever. But if you have a curve that looks like this, which is probably the most, if you take nothing away from this, but if you like just screenshot this curve in your mind, that the flow curve is kicked out, and you can think that is synonymous with the patient's, pulling flow and volume more than what their normal delta pressure and their mechanics would allow. And that plateau is something that you don't know what it is. So it could be high. So if you have someone on the vent and they have ARDS, and you want to do some low tidal volume strategy, and they are, have a tremendous drive to breathe, and they're pulling all this extra flow and volume, but you don't know, and you set the vent, you set like the PEEP of 10, and you make the inspiratory pressure 15. So you think like, wow, okay, the plateau isn't going to go above 25. If the curve looks like that, you don't know what the plateau is, and it's more than likely above 25. So in the subsequent breath, if you did a breath hold, you would get the plateau and it would be higher. And then you would, that's not good for anyone. Okay. All right. So that sort of caught us up to sort of walking through the curves. And obviously, if there's like any questions, you guys can like put them in the chat or unmute if you're feeling extra spicy. Yeah. Okay. So normal. So how do we get this? Like, what do we do? How do we sort of get this? If this is normal, right? We can break down what we're seeing on the curves, essentially. We said before, this is the alveolar pressure. This is your peak inspiratory pressure. This is sort of like your I time, right? You get this exponential decay. Once flow goes to zero, that means that your alveolar pressure sort of equals your area pressure at the end of the breath. Now, that's not always true because it depends on the mechanics, but to sort of understand this, we'll assume that that's true because it makes sort of like understanding this whole thing easier. Okay? So we'll just assume that they we'll put that stipulation that they equal at the end of the breath. So this is your peak inspiratory flow. So now your area under the curve. So this part. So this like kind of upside down triangle, whatever you want to call it. This, if I shaded this in, this would be the proportion of the curve or the proportion of the area under the pressure curve that is due to the flow and resistive portion. Right? It's like its makeup. And as you see, it gets less and less and less as you go through your breath cycle and as your lung sort of fills up. Okay. And then eventually it sort of goes to zero because there's no more flow, right? We get to zero flow. So it gets to zero. And then your pressure is made up completely of your V over C plus your PEEP total component, i.e. alveolar pressure, your plateau pressure, whatever you want to call it. So subsequently, you have your peak inspiratory flow, the area under this curve. So remember, this is the flow. So this is liters per second or liters per minute. If you multiply that out, you would get just liters. So, so flow is liters per second. If your inspiratory time is 1 second, if you did liters per second times 1 second, the seconds would cancel and you'd be left with liters. So that's your total volume here. Okay. Then similarly with your volume curve, you have exponential decay on exhalation. We call this sort of exponential rise on inspiration because your volume is rising exponentially because it's related to the pressure differential that you set up. Whereas if we had volume control with a constant flow, then you wouldn't have an exponential rise in volume. You would have a linear rise in volume because your flow is constant. So because your flow is constant, you have a linear rise in volume. In this situation, the flow is at the highest in the beginning and sort of goes down as you move through inspiration. The volume is the highest in the beginning, and then it gets lower and lower as you move through inspiration. And this always confused me, honestly. It's not like sort of volume this way, right? Like this is the time. So it's volume on the y-axis. So you get a lot more volume. Like there's more volume represented from like here to here than there is from like here to here. You know what I mean? So like you get most of your volume sort of in the beginning because most of your flow is in the beginning because that pressure differential is the highest in the beginning. So, this was sort of like how I sort of wrote the waveform book, was sort of like pointing this stuff out in the book and sort of like what changes as we change the different parameters. So this is normal. So if you did nothing else and just like took a screenshot of this and then, when you're on service next or whatever you're doing, if you have a patient on the ventilator and they're on pressure control or some pressure-based mode, PRVC, APV, whatever you want to call it, and if it doesn't look like this, that means that the patient isn't passive. And then remember what's important about that. So if the patient's not passive, you can't make certain assumptions about the pressures and the plateau and the driving pressure and et cetera. So I think that's probably the most important thing to point out and the hardest thing to wrap our minds around with pressure control. So remember, we control the I time with pressure control. So if we change the I time, how would the curve change? So let's say we started with an I time of 1 second and now we made the I time, forget what I made the first one. I think I made it longer. So I made the I time longer, right? The volume is the same though. And this always trips the learners up. Besides melody, does anyone want to take a stab at why the volume is the same if your inspiratory time is longer? But I know Melody knows because we talked about this before, probably. No worries if you don't want to. I'd be hard pressed to come off mute also, to be honest. Because there's no extra area under the curve, says JD from Canada, it looks like. Because there's no extra area under the curve. That's true. Taking a step further, why is there no extra area under the curve, I guess? Flow went to zero. True. Flow went to zero. Not why did flow? You guys are like dancing around it. For this example specifically, yeah, for this example, because volume can change sometimes. Changes, inspiratory pressure is the same, so no further flow. Now pressure and alveolar pressure equal. Good. So you guys are all sort of like, it's like death by 1,000 cuts. I agree the flow is at zero and holding there. Yeah, so you're all right, actually, to be honest with you, which I've always got annoyed at when people have said, because then like, how's everyone right, but nobody's right, or there's sort of a perfect right answer. So you're all right in the sense that, and you're recognizing that the flow goes to zero, which it does. There's no more area under the curve, which there isn't. And we set the inspiratory time and all that stuff. But the point that Christina sort of hit home is that, we didn't change the delta pressure, right? Like the delta pressure was still the same. So the delta was like whatever, 15, let's say, right? So I didn't change the delta here, right? We just made the I time longer. But remember, if the patient's not participating, once the pressures equalize, then there's not going to be any more flow. If there's no more flow, then there's no more volume. If there's no more volume, then there's no more pressure. If there's no more pressure, then your airway pressure equals your alveolar pressure. So maybe you got, this is probably like, this is like a niche crew, obviously. It's going to be on like event Zoom. So of course you're going to get it. But I think most people that I talk to, at least, like the learners, like attendings too. So, it's not just like residents or fellows, like attendings on top of it. This like sort of evades them because they would think like, there's a longer I time. So of course there'd be more volume. But if the patient's passive and not, the patient's passive and we didn't change anything about the mechanics, i.e. we didn't change the delta pressure, then you won't get any more flow and volume. Therefore, your airway pressure will be the same. So we almost call this like, you can call this like a plateau hold. Some of the vents like on like VC, you could do like a sort of like a plateau hold at the end. So the flow, so if you do a plateau hold at the end on like a servo, let's say, right, in volume control, you set it for like 0.1 second, 0.2 seconds, 0.3 seconds. At the end of inspiration, it'll just hold the flow at zero and then sort of transduce a pressure. And then that's called a plateau hold. It's sort of not overly helpful. It's helpful sometimes in ARDS if you want to like monitor the plateau pressure in real time instead of like doing it yourself. But you would see like there's no flow, from like here to here. So you're just at your plateau pressure. You're just at your alveolar pressure. If the patient, so then to take it a step further, but I think I forget where I brought this up. I brought it up at one point. So let's just say this happened. And then let's say that like you saw a little spike right here. Now what do you call that? So you had this like flow, right? Goes to zero. But like, the volume, like the pressure spikes up there. What would you call that? Nice. Delayed cycle. Perfect. So that's delayed cycle, right? When there's no more flow and the only way that the pressure goes higher is if the patient's like pushing out against the vent. So trying to get it to cycle. So that's delayed cycle dysynchrony or asynchrony, whatever you call it. I call it dysynchrony. So does Melody. So that makes me feel better because I feel like we're right all the time. Okay, perfect. So that was longer inspiratory time. Okay. So, can you like walk up to a vent? I mean, I guess so. With longer inspiratory time, you can sort of walk up to a ventilator, look at this, look at the flow go to zero, and you'll know intuitively like what the airway pressure or what the alveolar pressure is because the flow is at zero. And then obviously if you see the little sort of uptick in pressure, that's delayed cycling because the patient wants the vent to cycle faster. So go from inspiration to expiration. It's not, so the patient starts to push against it to get it to cycle. So you can fix that with the I time. So let's say, this was like 1 second. Let's say and this was like 1.5, let's say we made this like 0.5 seconds, right? So in shorter inspiratory time, which you might be able to deduce, you cut the inspiratory time in half. Because you cut the inspiratory time in half, you don't have as high a volume. So from that, you should be able to kind of like deduce that your alveolar pressure will be less. Since your alveolar pressure is less at the end of inspiration, you'll still have flow because there's still a pressure gradient. So here, right, there's still flow because it didn't get to zero. So it didn't get to here. So your alveolar pressure is less and you have less volume. Now, obviously that's important because if there was the pH or something was some number and you cut the inspiratory time in half, then the minute ventilation is going to go down, the pH will go down because your PCO2 will rise, etc. So, shorter inspiratory time is sort of like, I think, easier to comprehend. Longer inspiratory time is, that's why I think it's important to think about it from the point of the equation of motion, because when you think about it in setting up pressure differentials, I think you're able to sort of like deduce what you're seeing on the waveforms better. All right, so let's change resistance and see. So this is normal. So this is increased resistance. So there's, a plug, there's bronchospasm, there's the patient's biting the tube. Instead of the volume, or instead of the, maybe it was like an 8.0 tube, and then the balloon popped, and they, exchange it quickly and put like a 6 in or something. So if you were getting some volume and some pressure based on some delta, when you increase the resistance, then you're going to get less flow. So the flow goes down, which is what we see here, right? The flow goes down because for the same pressure differential, your resistance has gone up. Therefore, your flow is going to go down. Because your flow went down, you're going to get less volume. And then because you have the same inspiratory time, you're going to have end inspiratory flow, meaning your alveolar pressure and your airway pressure didn't equal, right? So less volume, less flow, less pressure. And then this is, we're doing sort of like inspiration only type deal. But in expiration, what you'll see is, right, our longer time constant. So that wasn't longer, that was shorter. Let me erase that because it's super confusing. All right, perfect. So this black line is a longer time constant than this black line, right? So if I superimpose this over here, so let's say this was normal, at every time point, there's more volume because there's less flow coming out because of some time constant issue, either resistance or compliance. And obviously in this situation, it's resistance. Similarly, because the pressure is less and your resistance is higher, your peak expiratory flow goes down and your time constant elongates. So, if we fired like another breath here, right? Like this is sort of two of the signs of auto peep, right? We have end expiratory flow, and we're not reaching the baseline, right? Because it doesn't sort of like get to this baseline. So this would set us up for like auto peep and all that kind of stuff, which would then compound the issue, because instead of starting at peep, you would start at auto peep, right? Peep, or you would start at a higher total peep, because you would have whatever peep you set, and then whatever peep is above that in auto peep, and then that's like your total peep. So then even more, your volume would go down as you build auto peep and as you have increased resistance. I said this before, but I personally think, and sure, you can work any vent mode as long as you know what you're doing, you set things up correctly. I just think like in severe asthma or COPD, it's like volume control is just easier because you don't, everyone sort of like understands to set like peak area pressure alarms. I think like the minute ventilation alarm I've seen like really wide before. I've seen it anywhere from 3 liters to like 12, and that's like a huge range to be in. So a lot of bad stuff can happen between those two. So this is one of the other reasons why I think volume control is better for obstructive lung disease personally. Okay, so if we have decreased resistance, then for the same pressure, your flow will be higher in the beginning, because since the resistance went down, even with that same delta pressure, you have less impedance to flow, and ergo higher flow in the beginning. Your airway pressure rises, you get flow over time, you get a volume. Now, why is the volume the same if your flow is higher, right? Wouldn't you think that if your flow is higher over the same amount of time, that you should get more volume? Anyone want to take a stab at that one? You guys are on fire tonight, so I'm like very confident you're going to get this. So when the resistance goes down, your peak inspiratory flow goes up because there's less resistance for the same pressure, but you get the same amount of volume. Wouldn't you think that you should get more volume if your flow is higher? Thinking hard. Going once, going twice. Not sure. This one's harder. Yeah, agree. So, we didn't change anything about the compliance of the lung, right? So since we didn't change anything about the compliance of the lung, even though we're getting more flow over time, it's going to inflate. Yeah. So Christina said, since your inspiratory pressure is the same, you get the same PIP equals P alpha quicker. Exactly. So even though your flow is higher, your delta gradient is still the same, right? Your delta gradient is still the same, because remember, this is all about setting up pressure gradients. So if your gradient is still the same, your flow could be whatever, but it's going to stop once you have no more gradient. Now, keep that in your mind's eye, because with compliance, it's different, right? Because with compliance, for each change in delta volume, if your compliance goes up or down, you're going to change your delta pressure. So if you have higher compliance, then each change in delta volume would be less of a change in delta pressure. So in that regard, you can get more volume when your compliance is higher.